Before we dive into one of the most haunting and controversial murder cases in European history, I need you to do something. Whether you're listening from New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Toronto, or anywhere else, drop your city in the comments right now. I read every one, and I want to know where this story is reaching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about justice, family, and the devastating power of accusation. In the quiet countryside of southern Illinois, there exists a small village called Ina. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where doors are left unlocked, and where the rhythm of life moves slowly, peacefully. In 1987, Ina had a population of around 460 people. It was surrounded by farmland, stretches of woodland, and the kind of rural tranquility that draws families seeking a simple, safe life away from the chaos of cities. The village sits in Jefferson County, not far from Rend Lake, a large reservoir that provides water to the region. There's a water treatment plant there, essential infrastructure for the area. Railroad tracks run through the landscape, remnants of the Illinois Central Railroad, now operated by Union Pacific. These tracks connected small towns like Ina to the broader world, carrying freight through the heart of rural America. It was here, in this peaceful corner of Illinois, that a young family made their home. Their story is one that would come to haunt not only the residents of Ina, but everyone who has ever heard the details of what happened on a cold November night in 1987. This is the story of the Dardeen family. Russell Keith Dardeen was born on June 22, 1958. He grew up in Mount Carmel, Illinois, a town about 40 miles northeast of Ina. Keith, as he preferred to be called, was the kind of person people described as reliable, kind, and devoted to his family. He had grown up in a household where his parents, Russell and Joan Dardeen, though divorced, remained on good terms and lived near each other. Keith carried with him the values of his upbringing: hard work, family loyalty, and a quiet faith. In August of 1979, Keith married Ruby Elaine Cowling in Albion, Illinois. Elaine, who also preferred to go by her middle name, was 30 years old at the time of her death in 1987. She was born and raised in the area, a woman known for her gentle demeanor and her talent for music. She played the piano beautifully, a skill she would later share with her church community. Together, Keith and Elaine built a life centered around faith, family, and simple joys. In 1984, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Peter Sean Dardeen. Peter was born on July 5th, and by November of 1987, he was 3 years old, a bright and energetic little boy who brought immense joy to his parents' lives. By 1986, Keith had completed the training necessary to work as a water treatment plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District. It was steady work, important work, the kind of job that provided stability for a growing family. With his new position secured, Keith purchased a mobile home, a beige and white trailer that he placed on land rented from a farming couple. The trailer sat nestled among trees, just off Route 37, outside the village of Ina. It was quiet there, isolated, but in a comforting way, the kind of place where a young family could feel safe and at peace. Elaine found work at an office supply store in Mount Vernon, the county seat, about 20 miles from their home. The couple managed their schedules carefully, ensuring that Peter was always cared for, that their home was a place of warmth and love. In their free time, they were deeply involved in their local Baptist church. Keith sang lead vocals during services, his voice carrying through the small congregation, while Elaine accompanied him on the piano. They were well loved in their community, seen as a model of devotion and stability. By the fall of 1987, Elaine was 7 months pregnant with their second child. If the baby was a girl, they would name her Casey. If a boy, Ian. They were excited, preparing for the arrival of this new life, imagining the joy of watching Peter become a big brother. Everything seemed to be falling into place for the Dardeen family. But beneath the surface of this tranquil existence, there was a growing unease. Southern Illinois in the mid-1980s was not as peaceful as it appeared. Jefferson County, where Ina is located, had experienced a troubling surge in violent crime. Between 1985 and 1987, there had been at least 15 homicides in the area. For a rural region with a small population, this was an alarming number. The crimes were varied, some connected, others seemingly random. The violence created an atmosphere of fear that hung over the communities like a dark cloud. One of the most disturbing incidents had occurred in Mount Vernon in 1985. A teenager named Thomas Odell had murdered his parents and 3 siblings in their home, killing each family member as they returned to the house one by one. The brutality of the crime shocked the region, and though Odell was eventually convicted, the memory of what he had done lingered in the minds of those who lived nearby. In May of 1987, just months before the Dardeen murders, a 10-year-old girl was raped and killed in the area. The crime was never solved. The fear intensified. Parents became more protective of their children. People who had never locked their doors began doing so. Guns were purchased, security systems installed. The sense of safety that had once defined life in places like Ina was eroding. Keith Dardeen was acutely aware of the danger. He had expressed to his mother, Joanne, that he regretted moving to Ina, that he felt the area was becoming too violent. He told her he wanted to move the family back to Mount Carmel, even if it meant leaving his job at the water treatment plant. He was protective, vigilant. A friend later recounted an incident where a young woman came to the Dardeen trailer late one night, asking to use the phone. Keith refused to let her inside, unwilling to take any risk with his family's safety. But despite his caution, despite his awareness of the dangers around him, Keith could not protect his family from what was coming. November 17, 1987, was a Tuesday. It was a day like any other for the Dardeen family. Keith prepared for his overnight shift at the water treatment plant. His shift began at 7 a.m. on the morning of November 18th. Elaine, heavily pregnant, stayed home with Peter. The trailer was warm. The family settled in for the evening. There is no record of anything unusual happening that night. No reports of disturbances. No sign of the horror that was about to unfold. But sometime during the late hours of November 17th or the early morning of November 18th, someone entered the Dardeen home. What happened next would become one of the most brutal and disturbing unsolved crimes in American history. On the morning of November 18th, Keith Dardeen did not show up for his shift at the water treatment plant. This was immediately noted as unusual. Keith was a reliable employee, the kind of worker who never missed a shift without calling, who took his responsibilities seriously. When 7 a.m. came and went with no sign of Keith, his supervisor grew concerned. He called Keith's home. There was no answer. He called again. Still nothing. The supervisor then reached out to Keith's parents. Russell Dardeen, Keith's father, had not heard from his son. Neither had Joanne, Keith's mother. Both were immediately worried. Keith would never simply fail to show up for work without explanation. Something was wrong. By early evening, the concern had grown into alarm. Keith's father, Don Dardeen, contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. He explained the situation, the missed shift, the unanswered phone calls. Officers agreed to meet him at the Dardeen home. Don drove to Ina with the key to the trailer, arriving around 6:30 p.m. The deputies approached the mobile home cautiously. The area was quiet, the trailer dark. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious indication of anything wrong from the outside. But when they unlocked the back door and stepped inside, they were confronted with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The interior of the trailer was a scene of unimaginable violence. In the bedroom, on a waterbed, lay the bodies of Elaine Dardeen, 3-year-old Peter, and a newborn infant. All 3 had been beaten to death. Elaine had been struck repeatedly with a baseball bat. The bat, investigators would later determine, had been a birthday gift that Keith had given to Peter earlier that year. The irony of this, the cruelty of using a father's gift to his son as a murder weapon, added a layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. The beating Elaine endured was so severe that it had caused her to go into labor. She was 7 months pregnant at the time of the attack. The trauma of the assault forced her body to deliver the baby prematurely. The infant, a girl, would have been named Casey. She was born into a nightmare, and her life lasted only moments. The killer or killers showed no mercy. The newborn was beaten to death, just like her mother and brother. Elaine's hands had been bound with duct tape. Her mouth was gagged. The bodies had been arranged on the bed, covered, almost as if someone had tried to tuck them in. The area around the bed had been cleaned. Blood had been wiped away. This suggested that whoever had committed these murders had spent time in the trailer after the killings, methodically erasing evidence, staging the scene. Peter, the 3-year-old boy, had also been bludgeoned with the baseball bat. The violence inflicted on a child so young was beyond comprehension. Investigators who worked the case would later describe it as the most horrific crime scene they had ever encountered. But Keith Dardeen was not in the trailer. His body was not among those found in the bedroom. The question immediately arose: where was Keith? And had he been the one to commit these murders? The initial suspicion fell on Keith. Statistically, when a family is murdered, the husband and father is often the perpetrator. The lack of forced entry suggested that the killer had been let into the home or had a key. The brutality of the crime, while extreme, could theoretically be explained by a domestic dispute that escalated beyond control. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Keith had killed his family and then fled. But this theory would not hold for long. On the morning of November 19th, hunters discovered a body in a wheat field near Ina. The field was about a mile from the Dardeen trailer. The body was that of Keith Dardeen. He had been shot multiple times. His genitals had been mutilated, a grotesque detail that suggested a deeply personal motive or a message left by the killer. The condition of Keith's body made it clear that he had not taken his own life. He had been murdered. Keith's car was found parked outside the police station in Benton, Illinois, about 11 miles from the Dardeen home. Blood was found in the car's interior, indicating that Keith had been killed inside the vehicle or that his body had been transported in it after death. The car's location, parked brazenly outside a police station, seemed almost like a taunt, a challenge to law enforcement. Forensic analysis determined that Keith had been killed within an hour of his family. The timeline suggested that Keith had been taken from the trailer, possibly at gunpoint, murdered elsewhere, and then the killer or killers had returned to the home to eliminate the witnesses. Elaine, Peter, and the newborn Casey were killed to ensure there would be no one left to identify the perpetrator. The realization that an entire family had been slaughtered, that even a newborn infant had been murdered, sent shockwaves through southern Illinois. The crime was so brutal, so senseless, that it defied understanding. Who could do such a thing, and why? The investigation into the Dardeen family murders was massive. 30 detectives worked the case full-time in the initial weeks. More than 100 people were interviewed. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. But despite the intensity of the effort, the case quickly grew cold. There was very little physical evidence. The crime scene had been cleaned. There were no fingerprints left behind, no DNA samples that could be tested with the technology available in 1987. The murder weapon, the baseball bat, had been left at the scene, but it offered no clues as to who had wielded it. The tape used to bind Elaine was common, available at any hardware store. The bullets that killed Keith were standard ammunition, untraceable. Investigators interviewed Keith's co-workers, friends, and family. They found no indication of marital problems, no financial troubles, no hidden enemies. By all accounts, the Dardeens were a happy, stable family. They attended church regularly, paid their bills on time, and were well-liked by everyone who knew them. There was no obvious motive for someone to target them. The rural location of the trailer suggested that the killer might have been a transient, someone passing through the area. The proximity to Route 37 and the railroad tracks meant that drifters, hitchhikers, or itinerant workers could have been in the vicinity. Southern Illinois in the 1980s saw a fair amount of transient traffic, people moving from place to place, working at carnivals, hopping freight trains, seeking temporary labor. One theory that gained traction was that the murders were the work of a cult. The sheer brutality of the crime, the mutilation of Keith's body, the ritualistic way the victims were arranged, all suggested a level of depravity that seemed beyond the capacity of an ordinary criminal. Some investigators speculated that the Dardines had been chosen for a sacrificial killing, that the murders were meant to appease some dark force. But there was no evidence to support this theory, no cult activity identified in the area, no ritualistic symbols found at the scene. Another theory was that the killer had mistaken the Dardines for someone else. Perhaps the intended victims lived nearby, and the killer, unfamiliar with the area, had gone to the wrong trailer. This could explain why a family with no known enemies, no criminal connections, no apparent motive for being targeted, had been murdered. But if this was true, the intended victims were never identified, and the theory remained speculative. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case remained unsolved. Tips came in regularly, thousands of them, but none led to an arrest. The Dardine family murders became one of the most infamous cold cases in Illinois, a symbol of the randomness and horror that can intrude into even the most innocent lives. In the years following the murders, the case faded from public attention. The residents of Ina and the surrounding areas never forgot what had happened, but the intense media scrutiny and the constant fear began to subside. Life moved on, as it always does, even in the shadow of tragedy. Joan Dardine, Keith's mother, never stopped seeking answers. At least once a week, she would call the sheriff's office, urging them to keep working on the case, to not let her son's murder be forgotten. She became a vocal advocate for justice, appearing in media interviews, pushing for the case to remain active. Her grief was profound, her determination unshakable. But as the 1990s progressed, it seemed increasingly unlikely that the killer would ever be found. The trail had gone cold. The evidence was minimal. The chances of solving the case diminished with each passing year. Then, in 1999, something unexpected happened. A serial killer in Texas would bring the Dardine family murders back into the spotlight, offering a potential resolution to the mystery. But as with so much in this case, the answers would prove elusive, and the truth would remain just out of reach. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California. His childhood was marked by severe abuse, neglect, and instability. He described being sexually abused as a child in the Missouri Bootheel, experiences he claimed led him to develop a coping mechanism of forgetting the details of traumatic events. This inability or unwillingness to remember would later become a characteristic of his confessions to crimes. By his late teens and early 20s, Sells was living a transient lifestyle. He moved constantly, hitchhiking with truckers, hopping freight trains, working odd jobs at carnivals and fairs, and committing theft to survive. He had no permanent address, no stable relationships, and no ties to any particular place. His mode of living made him difficult to track and allowed him to move through the country largely unnoticed. On December 31, 1999, Sells broke into a home near Del Rio, Texas. Inside, two girls were asleep. Sells attacked them with a knife, cutting their throats. One of the girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, died from her injuries. The other, 10-year-old Crystal Searles, survived despite having her throat slashed. She managed to escape and provide a description of Sells to police. Her testimony led to his arrest. While in custody, Sells began confessing to a long list of murders. He claimed to have killed more than 70 people across multiple states. His confessions were often inconsistent, filled with details that didn't match known facts, and it became clear that Sells was, at times, either fabricating or misremembering events. However, authorities were able to confirm his involvement in at least 22 murders. Sells was eventually convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Kayleen Harris. In 2000, while awaiting trial, Sells confessed to the Dardine family murders. He claimed he had been traveling through southern Illinois in November 1987. According to Sells, he met Keith Dardine either at a truck stop near Mount Vernon or at a local pool hall. The story varied depending on which interview Sells was giving. In some versions, Sells claimed that Keith invited him back to the trailer for dinner. In others, he suggested that Keith propositioned him for a sexual encounter involving Elaine, a three-way arrangement that Sells said angered him. Sells described entering the Dardeen home and committing the murders. He claimed he beat Elaine and Peter to death with the baseball bat, that he killed the newborn, and that he then took Keith from the home, killed him, and left his body in the field. Some of the details Sells provided matched the crime scene, details that seemed to lend credibility to his confession. But there were significant problems with Sells' account. First, Sells' story about how he met Keith was inconsistent. In one telling, it was a truck stop. In another, a pool hall. He could not keep the details straight, and investigators viewed this as a red flag. If Sells had truly committed the murders, he should have been able to recall, at least broadly, how he had encountered the family. Second, the claim that Keith invited Sells, a dirty, unkempt drifter, into his home strained credulity. Those who knew Keith described him as extremely protective of his family, especially in light of the violent crimes occurring in the area. A friend recounted how Keith had refused to let a young woman use his phone late one night because he didn't want to take any risk. The idea that Keith would invite a stranger into his home, particularly one who fit the profile of the kind of transient that made him uneasy, seemed highly unlikely. Third, Sells' claim that Keith propositioned him for a sexual encounter was met with disbelief by Keith's family and friends. There was no evidence that Keith had any interest in men. His marriage to Elaine was, by all accounts, happy and stable. The suggestion that Keith would invite a stranger to engage in a sexual act with his heavily pregnant wife seemed not only improbable but offensive to those who knew him. Detectives who interviewed Sells came to believe that he had invented this detail to make the crime seem more justified, to suggest that the victims had provoked him in some way. Sells had a pattern of including similar stories in his confessions to other murders, often painting his victims as having done something to deserve their fate. This was seen as a psychological defense mechanism, a way for Sells to distance himself from the full weight of his actions. Fourth, when pressed on specific details of the crime scene, Sells gave inconsistent answers. He was asked about the position of Elaine's body on the waterbed. He guessed incorrectly multiple times before finally getting it right. While he knew some details that matched the crime, these details could have been gleaned from media reports, which had covered the case extensively in the years following the murders. Despite Sells' confession, authorities in Illinois were never able to definitively link him to the Dardeen family murders. He was never charged with the crime. The confession was deemed unreliable, filled with too many inconsistencies and too much doubt. Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014, in Huntsville, Texas, for the murder of Kayleen Harris. He went to his death claiming responsibility for dozens of killings, including the Dardeens, but the truth of his involvement in many of those cases remains uncertain. Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mother, never believed that Sells was responsible for her son's murder. She dismissed his confession as the ramblings of a man seeking notoriety, a serial killer who wanted credit for crimes he didn't commit. For her, Sells' execution closed no doors and brought no peace. The question of who killed her son, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, and her newborn granddaughter remained unanswered. Over the years, other suspects have been considered. In 1999, before Sells' confession, there was brief interest in another serial killer, Angel Maturino Resendez, also known as the Railroad Killer. Resendez traveled the country by hopping freight trains, choosing victims near the tracks, and often beating them to death. The proximity of the Dardeen trailer to the railroad tracks and the method of murder suggested a possible connection. But investigators were never able to link Resendez to the crime. He was eventually executed in 2006 for other murders, and the Dardeen case was not among those he was convicted of. There have been theories that the murders were the work of someone local, someone who knew the Dardeens or knew of them. Perhaps the killer harbored a grudge, real or imagined. Perhaps there was a motive hidden beneath the surface, something that investigators never uncovered. But without evidence, without a suspect, these theories remain speculation. The most chilling possibility is that the killer was a complete stranger, a random predator who happened upon the Dardeen trailer and decided, for reasons known only to him, to commit an act of unspeakable violence. If this is true, then the Dardeen family murders were a crime of opportunity, a tragedy born of the worst kind of bad luck. And if this is true, then the killer may never be identified, may never face justice, may have lived out the rest of his life undetected. As of 2025, the Dardeen family murders remain officially unsolved. The case is still active, maintained in the cold case files of the Illinois State Police. Periodic reviews are conducted, new leads are investigated when they arise, and advances in forensic technology are applied to the evidence that was collected in 1987. In recent years, there has been renewed public interest in the case, driven in part by true crime podcasts and documentaries. These media productions have introduced the story of the Dardeen family to new audiences, keeping the case in the public consciousness and ensuring that the victims are not forgotten. But despite the attention, despite the advancements in DNA analysis and other forensic techniques, no breakthrough has come. No new suspect has emerged. The mystery of who killed Keith, Elaine, Peter, and Casey Dardeen remains as impenetrable as it was on that November evening in 1987, when police first entered the trailer and discovered the horror within. The Dardeen family murders stand as a reminder of the fragility of safety, of how quickly and brutally a peaceful life can be shattered. Keith and Elaine Dardeen were ordinary people, living an ordinary life, raising their son, preparing for the birth of their daughter, participating in their church, working their jobs. They had no enemies, no dark secrets, no reason to believe that their lives were in danger. And yet, on a November night in 1987, someone entered their home and destroyed them. The randomness of it, the senselessness, is what haunts those who study this case. There is no satisfying explanation, no narrative that makes sense of what happened. There is only the fact of the murders, the brutality of the crime, and the absence of justice. For Joan Dardeen, Keith's mother, the pain of losing her son and his family never faded. She spent the rest of her life advocating for the case to remain active, for investigators to never stop searching for answers. She wanted to know who had done this. She wanted to see them brought to justice. But she died without ever receiving the closure she sought. The residents of Ina, Illinois, and the surrounding areas carry the memory of the Dardeen family with them. The case changed the community, made people more fearful, more suspicious, more aware of the darkness that can exist even in the most peaceful places. The sense of security that once defined life in rural southern Illinois was shaken, and for many, it never fully returned. The Dardeen family murders are a cold case, but they are not a forgotten case. The story of what happened to Keith, Elaine, Peter, and Casey continues to be told, continues to be investigated, continues to haunt those who hear it. And as long as the case remains unsolved, there is hope that one day, perhaps the truth will finally be uncovered. Perhaps someone somewhere knows something. Perhaps a deathbed confession will one day be made. Perhaps advances in forensic science will reveal a clue that was missed in 1987. Or perhaps the killer took the secret to the grave, and the Dardeen family murders will remain forever a mystery, a dark chapter in the history of a small Illinois town. What we do know with certainty is that 4 innocent people lost their lives in a horrific act of violence. A young couple, full of hope and love, preparing for the future. A 3-year-old boy, just beginning to experience the world. And a newborn girl, whose life lasted only moments before it was taken from her. They deserved better. They deserved to live, to grow, to experience the joys and sorrows of life. Instead, they were victims of a cruelty that defies understanding. The Dardeen family murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American history. The brutality, the randomness, and the lack of resolution combine to create a story that stays with you, that lingers in your mind long after you've heard it. And so, as the rain continues to fall outside, as the night grows deeper and the world grows quieter, we remember Keith, Elaine, Peter, and Casey Dardeen. We remember the life they lived, the love they shared, and the tragedy that befell them. We remember and we hope that one day the truth will be known. Rest now. Let the rain wash away the darkness of this story. Let sleep come gently. The Dardeen family has not been forgotten. Their memory lives on, and somewhere, perhaps, the truth still waits to be discovered. Story 2. In the heart of Ohio, about 30 miles south of Columbus, lies a small town called Circleville. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where generations of families have lived side by side, where the annual pumpkin show brings the community together each October. In the mid-1970s, Circleville had a population of around 12,000 people. It was quiet, peaceful, and seemingly safe, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and children played freely in the streets. But in 1976, something changed in Circleville. Something that would transform this peaceful community into a place of fear, suspicion, and paranoia. It began quietly, with a single letter arriving in a mailbox. But over the next 2 decades, thousands of letters would follow, each one more threatening than the last. The residents of Circleville would come to dread the sound of the mail carrier's approach, wondering if today would be the day their darkest secrets were exposed. This is the story of the Circleville letters, a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. A story of anonymous threats, accusations, and a campaign of terror that destroyed lives, divided families, and haunted an entire town for nearly 20 years. To understand the Circleville letters, we must first understand the town itself. Circleville was named for the circular earthwork mounds built by the ancient Hopewell culture that once inhabited the region. The town was platted in a circular pattern in the early 1800s, though over time, the streets were straightened and the circular design faded. But the name remained, a reminder of the town's unique history. By the 1970s, Circleville was a typical small Ohio town. Most families had lived there for generations. People worked at local businesses, at factories in nearby cities, or on farms that surrounded the town. The Westfall School District served the area's children. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Office maintained law and order. Life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The town's major event each year was the Circleville Pumpkin Show, held every October since 1903. It was billed as the greatest free show on earth, featuring parades, agricultural exhibits, carnival rides, and pumpkin-themed foods. Thousands of visitors would descend on Circleville for 4 days each autumn, swelling the town's population and bringing a festive atmosphere to the streets. But beneath this Norman Rockwell exterior, Circleville was like any small town. There were secrets, there were affairs, there were grudges and jealousies that simmered beneath polite conversations and friendly waves. And in 1976, someone decided to expose those secrets one letter at a time. March 1977, Mary Gillespie walked to her mailbox as she did every day. Mary was a school bus driver for the Westfall School District. She was married to Ron Gillespie, a local man who worked in the area. They had children, including a daughter named Tracy. The Gillespies were a well-known family in Circleville, the kind of family that had deep roots in the community. Mary opened her mailbox and pulled out the day's mail. Among the bills and advertisements was an envelope that immediately caught her attention. It was addressed to her in distinctive block lettering. There was no return address. The postmark said Columbus, Ohio, but there was nothing to indicate who had sent it. Mary opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter that would change her life forever. The letter accused Mary of having an affair with Gordon Massey, the superintendent of the Westfall School District. The letter was specific, detailed, and threatening. It read, in part, "Mrs. Gillespie, stay away from Massey. Don't lie when questioned about meeting him. I know where you live. I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. Everyone concerned has been notified. It will be over soon." Mary was shocked. The accusation was deeply personal, and the threat was clear. Whoever wrote this letter claimed to be watching her home, claimed to know about her family, claimed to have shared this information with others. Mary didn't know what to do. She kept the letter to herself, hoping it was just a cruel prank that would end as quickly as it had begun. But a week later, another letter arrived. This one was even more threatening. It repeated the accusation about the affair and warned Mary that if she didn't end the relationship, there would be consequences. The tone was angrier, more insistent. Mary realized this was not going to stop on its own. The accusation at the heart of the letters was that Mary Gillespie was having an affair with Gordon Massey, the superintendent of schools. Gordon Massey was a married man, a respected figure in the community. The idea that he and Mary were involved in an extramarital relationship was scandalous. In a small town like Circleville, such accusations could ruin reputations, destroy families, and turn neighbors against each other. Mary continued to receive letters, and then her husband, Ron Gillespie, began receiving them too. The letters to Ron were more direct and more menacing. One letter read, "Mr. Gillespie, your wife is seeing Gordon Massey. You should catch them together and kill them both." Another letter warned, "Gillespie, you have had 2 weeks and done nothing. Make her admit the truth and inform the school board. If not, I will broadcast it on CBs, posters, signs, and billboards until the truth comes out." The letter writer was escalating. The threats were becoming more specific, more public. The idea of having their private lives exposed on CB radios and billboards terrified Mary and Ron. In a small town, gossip spreads quickly, and once a rumor takes hold, it can be nearly impossible to stop. Mary and Ron decided to confide in a few trusted family members. They told Ron's sister. They told her husband, Paul Freshour. They told Paul's sister. The small circle of confidants tried to figure out who might be sending the letters. They made a list of people who might have a grudge against Mary or the Gillespies. They tried to think of anyone who might know enough about their lives to make such specific accusations. Paul Freshour, Ron's brother-in-law, suggested a strategy. He proposed that they send letters back to the person they suspected, making it seem like they knew the writer's identity. The hope was that this would scare the letter writer into stopping. Ron and Paul sent 4 or 5 letters to the person they believed was responsible. The letters were not violent or threatening, just enough to suggest they were onto the writer. For a while, the plan seemed to work. The letters stopped. Mary and Ron breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the ordeal was over. But their relief was short-lived. In August 1977, the letters returned, and this time they brought tragedy. On an evening in late August, Ron Gillespie was at home. His wife, Mary, was traveling to Florida. Ron received a phone call. His children later said that he became agitated, grabbed his .22 caliber revolver, and stormed out of the house. He told his daughter he was going to confront the letter writer. Ron got into his pickup truck and drove off into the night. Hours later, his truck was found crashed into a tree. Ron was dead. The official cause of death was ruled an accident. The investigation determined that Ron had a blood alcohol content of 0.16, twice the legal limit. The conclusion was that Ron had been drinking, lost control of his vehicle, and crashed. But Ron's family didn't believe it. They insisted that Ron was not a heavy drinker, that the blood alcohol level didn't make sense. They pointed to the fact that 1 bullet had been fired from Ron's gun, suggesting he had shot at someone or something before the crash. They believed Ron had gone to confront the letter writer, that there had been an altercation, and that Ron's death was not an accident but a murder. Ron's brother-in-law, Paul Freshour, was particularly vocal in his belief that Ron had been killed. Paul went to the Pickaway County Sheriff, Dwight Radcliffe, and urged him to investigate Ron's death as a homicide. At first, Sheriff Radcliffe seemed sympathetic, acknowledging that there were suspicious circumstances. But later, when Paul contacted him again, the sheriff had changed his story. He told Paul that there was no evidence of foul play, that a person of interest had been questioned and had passed a polygraph test. The case was closed. Ron's death was an accident. Paul Freshour was frustrated and angry. He believed there was a cover-up, that the sheriff was not doing his job, that whoever had killed Ron was being protected. But without any power to force a deeper investigation, Paul could do nothing but watch as Ron's death was officially deemed accidental. After Ron's death, the letters continued. In fact, they intensified. New letters began arriving in mailboxes all over Circleville. Some were addressed to Mary Gillespie, continuing the accusations about her affair with Gordon Massey. Others were addressed to Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, accusing him of covering up Ron's murder. Still others went to local officials, business owners, and ordinary residents, accusing them of various misdeeds. embezzlement, domestic violence, infidelity, corruption. The letter writer seemed to know everything about everyone. The letters contained details about people's private lives that should have been secret, affairs that had been carefully hidden, financial troubles that had been kept quiet, family disputes that had never been made public. The level of knowledge the writer possessed was frightening. It suggested that the writer was someone who lived in Circleville, someone who was embedded in the community, someone who heard the gossip and saw the secrets. The letters were written in distinctive block handwriting, all capital letters, with unusual punctuation and spacing. The writer often used colons instead of periods and had a particular style of phrasing that became recognizable over time. The envelopes were usually postmarked from Columbus, suggesting the writer was mailing the letters from the larger city to avoid detection. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing that could identify the sender. The psychological impact on the town was profound. People became paranoid. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Friendships fractured as people wondered if their closest confidants might be the letter writer. Trust, the foundation of any small community, began to erode. People stopped sharing personal information. They became guarded, careful, always aware that anything they said might end up in one of the letters. Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey eventually admitted that there had been a relationship between them, though they claimed it had only begun after the letters started. Whether this was true or whether they were trying to minimize the situation is unclear. But the admission did nothing to stop the letters. If anything, it seemed to embolden the writer, who now had a confession to point to as proof of the original accusation. For 6 years, the letters continued, hundreds of them. Some were mailed directly to individuals. Others were sent to the local newspaper, the Circleville Herald. Some were even sent to businesses, threatening to expose scandals unless certain demands were met. The writer's focus remained primarily on Mary Gillespie, but the scope expanded to include many others in the community. Then, in 1983, the letter writer escalated from words to action. Mary Gillespie had continued working as a school bus driver despite the harassment. One February day in 1983, as she was driving her route, she saw a handmade sign posted along the road at the intersection of Scioto Darby Road and 5 Points Pike. The sign contained an obscene remark about her teenage daughter, Tracy. Mary was furious. She had endured years of letters, years of accusations and threats, but now the writer was targeting her child. She stopped the bus, got out, and approached the sign, intending to tear it down. But as she grabbed the sign, she noticed something unusual. A piece of twine ran from the sign to a box hidden nearby. Mary paused. Something felt wrong. Instead of pulling the sign down, she carefully detached it and took the box back home. When she opened the box, she made a terrifying discovery. Inside was a loaded gun, rigged to fire when the sign was pulled. If Mary had yanked the sign down the way she had intended, the gun would have fired, and the bullet would likely have killed her. Mary immediately took the box to the police. Investigators from Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation examined the booby trap. The gun was a .25 caliber pistol, small but deadly at close range. The serial number had been partially filed off, but forensic experts were able to recover enough of it to trace the weapon's ownership. The gun had belonged to Paul Freshour, Ron Gillespie's brother-in-law. The revelation that the gun belonged to Paul Freshour was shocking. Paul was Mary's former brother-in-law, Ron's sister's husband. He had been one of the people Mary and Ron had confided in when the letters first started. He had been vocal in his belief that Ron had been murdered and that the sheriff was covering it up. He had seemed like an ally, someone who was fighting alongside the Gillespies for justice. Now, he was the prime suspect in an attempted murder. Police brought Paul Freshour in for questioning. Paul insisted he had nothing to do with the booby trap. He claimed his gun had been stolen. He suggested that someone was framing him, using his own weapon to make it look like he was the one who had tried to kill Mary. He took a handwriting test to compare his writing to the letters. The results were inconclusive. Some experts said there were similarities. Others said the differences were too significant to make a definitive match. But there was another piece of evidence that pointed to Paul. His estranged wife, Karen Freshour, told police that Paul was the one who had been writing the Circleville letters. Karen and Paul's marriage had been troubled. There were allegations of physical abuse, bitter custody disputes over their children, and deep resentment on both sides. Karen's testimony was damning, but it also raised questions. Was she telling the truth, or was she trying to frame her ex-husband out of spite? Despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, Paul Freshour was arrested and charged with attempted murder. At his trial, prosecutors argued that Paul had been writing the letters for years, that he had orchestrated the campaign of terror against Mary Gillespie and others, and that when the letters didn't achieve the desired effect, he had tried to kill Mary with the booby trap. The defense argued that Paul was being framed, that the evidence was weak, and that the real letter writer was still out there. The jury found Paul Freshour guilty. He was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison, but he was never formally charged with writing the Circleville letters. The conviction was solely for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie. Paul maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been set up and that the real letter writer had used his gun to frame him. If the story ended there, it would be a sad but straightforward tale of a man caught and punished for his crimes. But the Circleville letters case is not straightforward, and it did not end with Paul Freshour's conviction. Shortly after Paul was imprisoned, the letters continued. New letters arrived in Circleville, postmarked from various cities. The handwriting was the same distinctive block lettering. The tone was the same threatening, accusatory style. And perhaps most chillingly, Paul Freshour himself received a letter while he was in prison. The letter to Paul read, in part, "Freshour, now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago when we set him up. They stay set up." The letter seemed to be taunting Paul, suggesting that he had been framed and that the real letter writer was still free. It was a cruel twist, and it raised profound questions. If Paul Freshour was the letter writer, how could the letters continue while he was in prison? He was in a maximum security facility. He had no access to pens or paper. His mail was monitored. There was no way he could have sent the letters himself. Some people theorized that Paul had an accomplice, someone on the outside who was continuing the campaign on his behalf. But if that were true, why would the accomplice send a letter to Paul that seemed to mock him? Others suggested that the letters were being sent by someone else entirely, someone who had been inspired by the original Circleville letters and was now copying the style to create confusion. The most troubling possibility was that Paul Freshour was innocent, that he had been framed, and that the real letter writer was still out there, free and undetected. This theory gained credibility as the letters continued for years after Paul's imprisonment. They didn't stop until 1994, when Paul was released from prison after serving 10 years. Over the years, many theories have been proposed about the identity of the Circleville letter writer or writers. Some believe there was only one author, a single person with an obsessive grudge against Mary Gillespie or the Gillespie family. Others believe there were multiple writers, each with their own motivations, who took turns sending letters to create a sustained campaign of terror. One theory that has gained traction in recent years is that the letters were written by a combination of people, each targeting different individuals for different reasons. Journalist Martin Yant, who has investigated the case extensively, has suggested that at least 3 people may have been involved in writing the letters. According to Yant's research, one possible writer was the son of Gordon Massey, the school superintendent who was accused of having an affair with Mary. The son may have been motivated by anger or embarrassment over his father's infidelity and wanted to punish those involved. Another possible writer, according to Yant, was a co-worker of Mary Gillespie who was infatuated with her. This person may have written letters as a twisted way of expressing jealousy or possessiveness. A third possible writer was Paul Freshour's ex-wife, Karen, who may have written some of the later letters to frame Paul and ensure he stayed in prison. There is also the unsolved question of the man seen near the booby trap on the day Mary discovered it. Another bus driver on Mary's route reported seeing a man standing next to a yellow El Camino at the same spot where the trap was found, just 20 minutes before Mary arrived. The man was pretending to urinate, but his behavior seemed suspicious. The description of this man did not match Paul Freshour, and Paul had an alibi for that time. Yant discovered that a relative of one of the suspected letter writers owned a yellow El Camino, suggesting a possible connection. But the man was never identified, and the lead was never fully pursued by police. In recent years, forensic document expert Beverly East was hired to analyze the Circleville letters. East examined 49 of the letters and concluded that they were all written by the same person. She stated that she would testify in court under oath that one individual was responsible for all the letters. East's analysis suggested that Paul Freshour was likely the author, based on the handwriting characteristics. But her conclusion has been disputed by others who point to the fact that the letters continued while Paul was in prison, something East's analysis does not adequately explain. Paul Freshour served 10 years in prison for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie. Throughout his incarceration, he maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had been framed, that someone had stolen his gun and used it to set him up. He believed that the real letter writer had targeted him because he had been too vocal in pushing for an investigation into Ron Gillespie's death, that he had gotten too close to the truth, and that the writer had decided to eliminate him by sending him to prison. Paul was released in 1994. Within months of his release, the Circleville letters stopped. No new letters were sent. The campaign of terror that had lasted nearly 20 years came to an abrupt end. For some, this was proof that Paul had been the writer all along, that his release meant the end of the letters. For others, it was a coincidence, or perhaps the real writer had simply grown tired of the game and moved on. Paul Freshour spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. He gave interviews, corresponded with journalists, and maintained a blog where he discussed the case and his belief that he had been wrongly convicted. He never stopped insisting that he was innocent, that the real letter writer was still out there, and that the truth had never been uncovered. Paul Freshour died in 2012 at the age of 68. He died without ever learning the identity of the Circleville letter writer. He died without having his conviction overturned. He died still branded as the man who tried to kill Mary Gillespie and who terrorized a town for 2 decades. Whether he was guilty or innocent, whether he was the letter writer or a victim of a cruel frame-up, remains one of the great unanswered questions of the case. Mary Gillespie continued to live in the Circleville area after the letters stopped. She rarely spoke publicly about the case, declining interviews and avoiding media attention. The years of harassment had taken a toll on her life, her family, and her sense of security. Whether the accusations about her affair with Gordon Massey were true or false, whether she was a victim or a participant in the events that unfolded, she was undeniably someone who suffered greatly because of the letters. Gordon Massey, the school superintendent at the center of the affair allegations, also remained silent. He never gave extensive interviews about the case, and the details of his relationship with Mary were never fully clarified. He eventually retired from his position, and like Mary, he faded from public view. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, who was accused by some of covering up Ron Gillespie's death, also maintained his silence. When Unsolved Mysteries wanted to film a segment about the Circleville letters, both Sheriff Radcliffe and Mary Gillespie declined to be interviewed. Their refusal to speak has fueled speculation over the years that there were aspects of the case they didn't want to discuss, secrets they wanted to keep hidden. The town of Circleville slowly moved on from the trauma of the letters. The fear and paranoia that had gripped the community for nearly 20 years gradually faded. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an ordeal. But the memory of the letters never truly disappeared. For those who lived through it, the Circleville letters remain a dark chapter in the town's history, a reminder of how fragile trust and community can be. In recent years, the Circleville letters have been the subject of renewed interest. True crime podcasts, television documentaries, and online forums have all examined the case, bringing it to the attention of a new generation. In 2021, CBS's 48 Hours produced a special report on the case, interviewing surviving witnesses, examining the evidence, and exploring the various theories about the letter writer's identity. The 48 Hours investigation brought in former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole to analyze the letters. O'Toole, who has studied some of the most notorious serial criminals in American history, concluded that the letter writer was likely a single individual, someone who was methodical, obsessive, and skilled at evading detection. O'Toole described the writer as someone who flew under the radar, someone who appeared normal and trustworthy in everyday life, someone people would never suspect. O'Toole also noted that the continuation of the letters while Paul Freshour was in prison was a critical piece of evidence. She said that if a crime continues while the primary suspect is in custody and has no ability to commit it, then investigators must seriously consider the possibility that the wrong person was convicted. This doesn't prove Paul's innocence, but it does raise reasonable doubt. Forensic document expert Beverly East's analysis, while compelling, has not been universally accepted. Other handwriting experts have reviewed the letters and come to different conclusions. The science of handwriting analysis is not exact, and different experts can interpret the same evidence in different ways. Without definitive proof, such as DNA or fingerprints, the question of who wrote the Circleville letters remains open. The Circleville letters represent a unique type of crime. Unlike murder or robbery, where the harm is immediate and physical, the letters inflicted psychological harm that accumulated over years. The writer's power came not from violence but from knowledge, from the ability to see into people's lives and expose their secrets. In a small town where reputation is everything, this was a devastating weapon. The letters also reveal something about human nature and small-town dynamics. In Circleville, as in many small communities, people's lives are intertwined. Everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. Gossip spreads quickly. Secrets are hard to keep. The letter writer exploited this interconnectedness, using knowledge of the town's social fabric to maximize fear and disruption. But the letters also exposed the weaknesses of the investigation. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Office, while well-meaning, was not equipped to handle a case of this complexity. They lacked the resources, the expertise, and perhaps the objectivity needed to identify the letter writer. The focus on Paul Freshour, while understandable given the evidence of the booby trap, may have blinded investigators to other possibilities. Once Paul was convicted, there seemed to be little appetite for reconsidering the case, even when the letters continued. The case also highlights the limitations of forensic science, particularly in an era before DNA analysis became routine. Handwriting analysis, polygraph tests, and circumstantial evidence were the primary tools available to investigators. These tools are useful, but they are not foolproof. They can point to a suspect, but they cannot always prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As of today, the Circleville letters remain officially unsolved. Paul Freshour was convicted of attempted murder, but the question of who wrote the letters has never been definitively answered. The case is not actively investigated by law enforcement, though it remains in the files of the Pickaway County Sheriff's Office. For the residents of Circleville, the case is a part of their town's history, a story told to newcomers and remembered by those who lived through it. The Pumpkin Show still takes place every October, drawing crowds from across Ohio. Life in Circleville goes on as it always has, but the memory of those years, when simply checking the mail could bring fear and dread, lingers. The Circleville letters are a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of words on a page, accusations whispered in the dark, secrets exposed for the world to see. And sometimes the most terrifying thing of all is not knowing who is watching, who is writing, who knows your secrets. Who was the Circleville letter writer? Was it Paul Freshour, as the courts determined? Was it someone else, someone who framed Paul and then continued the letters to taunt him? Was it multiple people, each with their own grievances and motivations? Or was it someone who has never been publicly identified, someone who still lives in or near Circleville, carrying the secret of those letters to this day? We may never know. The people most closely involved in the case are gone or have chosen to remain silent. The evidence, such as it is, points in multiple directions. The theories are many, but the proof is elusive. What we do know is that for nearly 20 years, the residents of Circleville, Ohio, lived under the shadow of an anonymous writer who knew their secrets and was not afraid to expose them. We know that lives were destroyed, families were torn apart, and at least one person, Ron Gillespie, died under circumstances that remain suspicious. We know that another person, Paul Freshour, spent 10 years in prison for a crime he insisted he didn't commit. And we know that the mystery of the Circleville letters continues to fascinate and disturb those who hear about it. The letters have stopped. The writer, whoever they were, is either dead or silent. But the questions remain. And in Circleville, the memory of those letters and the fear they brought will never truly fade. Let the rain wash away the unease of this story. Let sleep come gently. The letters have stopped. The terror has ended. What remains is only a mystery, a question without an answer. Rest now, as the rain continues to fall, as the night deepens, as the world grows quiet. The Circleville letters are a part of history, a story told but never fully understood. Sleep well, knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved.